And then I'm not funny. Thanks, Hayley. Hard to compete with the sash and also to follow Uncle Tom. Thanks very much for the introduction. As an uninvited visitor to this place, can I begin by acknowledging Ngunnawal Ngambri peoples, their elders who have passed, those who are present and who have cared for this country for time immemorial, acknowledge their sovereignty nor their land was ever ceded. It always was and always will be Aboriginal land. So a bit of a stitch up, as I said, to follow Uncle Tom, but have the pleasure of working with him in lots of our work around cancer. But of course, I'm not going to speak about cancer today. Your CEO, Donna Murray, told me I wasn't allowed to. Another stitch up. She said, "You know more than cervix," and I was like, "Really?" It's an honour to be here. My first IAHA conference. I heard it's the biggest. Don't know if that's a correlation with me being here. No, gammon. It's also the first invitation to speak at a peak conference, so win for IAHA, thank you. I did go up to Donna at Nazi Whip and try and pull out, because I was pretty nervous about this. But given I'm standing here, you can see how that ended up if anyone's tried to say no to Donna Murray. Yeah, good luck. So I'll walk through what I hope to cover and achieve by the end of this talk that I've titled Black Excellence in Colonial Institutions. So I hope to cover the relational elements of the work that we do. Uncle Tom's just talked about the way that we care for our families, the accountability and always keeping front and centre about who we are actually accountable to, and what it means to be doing the work. It'll be no means a talk of theory, but I hope it can provide some useful insights at the start of this conference into work that's currently happening that does impact on you, and particularly in terms of health regulation, but some reflections that I've learned along the way as an Indigenous researcher. So I'm a Gumugal person of the Wagaragam tribe of Mabiag Island in the Western Torres Strait. You can see the arrow to the island of Mabiag, some pictures of my last visit home with some of my cousins. But I was born and raised on Walgarookaba Bindal country up in Townsville, and I'm the youngest of 3 girls. I'm also a researcher at the Australian National University in the newly established National Centre for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Wellbeing Centre. I tell you who I am and where I'm from as part of cultural protocol, but also to situate myself within the work that I do, the community I belong to, who claim me and who I serve. As distinguished Professor Aileen Morton-Robertson tells us, our cultural and social positioning informs how, when, where and why we conduct research, as well as our disciplinary knowledges and training as Indigenous women academics. Our lives are always shaped by the omnipresence of patriarchal white sovereignty and its continual denial of our sovereignty. This is important to understand because it locates how I view and conduct research and how I've come to think about the title of the presentation today. But importantly, how I think about my role as a researcher, not in an ivory tower serving the institution with academic output, but in being service to mob, my obligations and accountability to my family, and building on those before me and those who will long come after me. This is often the tension with the requirements of being an academic. Both my parents are social workers. It probably explains a lot about who I am, good or bad, I don't know. But my dad started out as a teacher, actually, before leaving the islands, leaving Mabiag, to bring down my ate, or my grandfather, to Townsville for treatment for the bends, which he acquired as a pearl diver. My dad then turned health worker before studying social work. My mother, a non-Indigenous woman with Irish ancestry who grew up in the Darling Downs, just outside of Toowoomba, in a big Catholic family. My grandfather ran a cheese factory. Also went on to social work. I tell you this because how these two people, my parents, came to social work has been a continuing interest of mine, one rooted in deep social justice, but in contrasting worldviews. Recently, I was sent this photo from Auntie Grace in Smallwood alongside my dad in 1975, a picture of a newspaper article from the Townsville Bulletin. I was really taken with the photo, apart from the deadly outfit that my dad's in. This is him here. with the white shoes. Only recently gave those up. So I hadn't seen this photo before, but it wasn't until I spoke to Dad on the weekend that we talked about what was actually written in the article. The picture shows Dr. John Court, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, or maybe I don't, but a professor of psychology at UNSW who spoke at a graduation ceremony after my dad, Arnie Graceland, and other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peers undertook, and I quote, a 14-week course on counselling and therapy to deal with their own people. In his address at the graduation ceremony, which was to the majority of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, he discussed racial tensions at the time, that white people saw the gambling, drinking and working habits of the Aboriginal people and tends to deplore them. He said, I wonder at times whether they'll ever look back at the origin of these problems. We must understand, I go on to quote, we must understand that there are tensions. You have been invaded, conquest has taken place, and you have been overrun. We must expect tensions to occur. Referring to the graduates at the ceremony, he told the audience they should not be regarded as experts in this field. I quote, there are 5 people who have been trained a little in this area, but you have to be trained for 2 or 3 years before coming to understand these fully. Don't think you are experts. You have just put a hand to the plough. I'd like to hear him say that to Arnie Graceland now. And here, 47 years later, as the daughter and niece of some of these graduates, herein lies the very violence of continuing to bring black excellence in the face of colonial institutions and the racists that they house. It speaks to the training and increase in the number of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander health practitioners across a broad range of fields, many sitting here with us today, all as experts, but rarely appreciated as such. Despite their lived experience and expertise, always and never wavering as being ontologically black. And even in the face of some thought about the ongoing oppression we have and continue to face, the white practitioner's ability to absolve themselves of responsibility shouldn't, but continues to surprise me. So I stand here as an Indigenous researcher with no clinical or health practitioner training. I trained as an epidemiologist after a brief time considering a career in medicine, only to realise that sick people and me, not so good, but also that population research, particularly about health systems, was the piece of the puzzle that I could contribute to. I was lured by epidemiology because it told stories as if they knew something that I didn't. I thought I would find the logic in organising of data, labelling, categorising, quantifying risks, preventing illness, finding out what it was they were so sure they knew about me. But as much as the discipline of epidemiology has contributed to highlighting the health inequities experienced by mob, it's all the statistics that we hear, it would be remiss to not acknowledge the vast contribution that epidemiology has made to creating, producing and perpetuating and reproducing alarming negative statistical portraits that garner little to no action and have rendered Indigenous people as less than human and incapable of saving themselves, all things we know are untrue. And while the majority of my work now focuses on eliminating cervical cancer for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, with a core focus and responsibility to providing and implementing evidence from an Indigenous worldview. It is no longer acceptable just to describe the problem and not to implement solutions that we all know our communities have. I understand that I'm accountable to considering how the health system changed beyond that of my research area, because how Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people receive care and how we care for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander health practitioners within these systems are both directly and indirectly related to the cervical cancer inequities I research. What I like most about research is thinking about a big issue and all the pieces of the puzzle needed to solve it. Understanding my role as an Indigenous epidemiologist, what it is, importantly what it isn't, to zoom out, look at the big picture, has helped me define where I think I can be of use. I know that this will change over time, that's a good thing, but at this moment I'm most useful as a foot soldier, providing evidence, crafting my skills. Technical skills are, I believe, a very underrated thing in Indigenous health from the colony's perspective. The colony wants us to be everything to everyone, all of the time, and for all things black. But it's a fallacy. It serves their agenda, not ours. Knowing when to step up, but importantly, when to step aside, is critical to defining the piece of the puzzle that you should hold. But core to overcoming any health issue is, of course, coming up with ways to dismantle the inherent function of the colonial project, of which is to erase us. And therein lies the active tension of the Indigenous researcher and or Indigenous practitioner, committed and accountable to caring for our mob in a society that is complicit and or committed to our ill health, while being both distracted by and subject to racism. And that is the thing about racism that makes me so angry. The way in which racism bears down on us, hits us front on, insidious, pervasive, undermining, but always present. It is unrelenting. It's like a blinding hot white light, torturous and distracting. And in the face of racism, for me, it's that deep anger that fuels this fight. This is not easy work, but it's a necessary work to ensure our families receive the care that they are deserving of on stolen lands. It is necessary work to ensure that we collectively can care for those that care for us, all of you, the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander health workforce in whatever field you work in. As Indigenous peoples have been subjected to countless policies and decisions around our health without our involvement, many direct forms of colonial violence to erase our existence, or by undermining our self-determination by centering their white benevolence in order to save us. So this brings me to tell you about some important work that I've had the honour of contributing to, and along with many others, addressing racism within health professions. In 2019, I was appointed to the Community Advisory Council of the Australian Health Practitioner Regulation Agency, otherwise known as AHPRA. AHPRA is the organisation responsible for the implementation of the National Registration and Accreditation Scheme across Australia, and many AHPRA staff are here today. Prior to my involvement in the scheme, foundational work had occurred from the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Health Strategy Group, some members shown here in this picture, a strategic body comprised of over 30 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander health experts, including external CEOs of Indigenous health organisations, some of you here today. The formation of this group led to the release of a 5-year Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander health cultural safety strategy, an important and necessary step to eliminating racism in the health system, signalling that patient safety for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people must be determined by Indigenous peoples. Having joined less than a year before the strategy was released, it demonstrated that AHPRA was committed to working with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people to ensure culturally safe practice, but I was most interested that they were willing to use their powers within law to regulate for that. It was at this time I considered how I could be of best use, noting that the space that I occupy, the skills that I have, and the skills that I don't. I'm a researcher. I'm not a CEO. I have very little decision-making power, but the nexus of strategy into implementation is where I know I can be of use. Some people often scoff, actually lots of people just scoff, and tell me how boring health regulation is. I can't always disagree. But I do see a direct link between the ability for us to care for our families and care for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander health profession with health regulation. It is by no means the only answer or solution, but it is one important mechanism that can, I dare say, helps to dismantle the colonial health system, the racism and violence it perpetuates, and hold those individuals to account and not just hide behind institutional racism. Having one definition has helped to form a common understanding and shared language amongst health professionals, codes of conduct, accreditation, registration standards. Under the leadership of Gamilaroi woman Ms Jade Fuller, who's the National Director of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Strategy Unit, and a very dear friend of mine, also sitting here, front and centre, with colleagues, Jade has forged a path to ensure that this strategy is not one that just sits on a shelf. The Health Strategy Unit convenes a dedicated working group comprised of strategy group members, myself included, who review profession-specific policies, standards, codes on a monthly basis to ensure a consistent adoption of the definition of cultural safety and appropriate consideration of the needs of Indigenous peoples and practitioners. The definition has been fundamental to underpinning so much of AHPRA's work. Its inclusion in the previously mentioned documents makes it very clear to practitioners that culturally safe care is an expected standard, meaning they will be held to account for not meeting the agreed level of performance. In October this year, we saw the introduction of legislative amendments around the country informed by the strategy group, NHLF and NATSIHISC, that prioritises cultural safety in healthcare provision. I understand it's the first time the word racism has been featured in healthcare legislation in Australia. It will align and strengthen the codes of conduct for registered health practitioners, compel tribunals and the court system, which operate quite separately to AHPRA, to take into account cultural safety in the cases that are put before them in applying the national law. And it means practitioners are required to take appropriate steps to educate themselves on cultural safety regarding the accessibility of their services. But what does this really mean for us? And what does this mean for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander consumers? The change means that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander health consumer can expect that healthcare provision from a registered health practitioner is culturally safe and free of racism. But this is the important part. If the care received fails to meet the expectation, it is within their right to notify AHPRA by submitting a complaint. If the complaint enters the court system, cultural safety is required to be taken into account as defined by the national law. Two other projects worth noting are the Culturally Safe Notifications Project and the Cultural Safety Research, which is looking at strategy evaluation, which also will look at coronial inquest analysis project. These projects are just two examples that form part of the implementation of the cultural safety strategy. This includes looking within AHPRA and the national scheme as a colonial institute to ensure that their processes and ability to manage complaints that mob may make must consider the role of racism and cultural safety in determining whether regulatory action is needed. As such, the project commencing shortly, led by a group of Indigenous people, including board and committee members, to reform the cultural safety of the complaints process, specifically those which relate to Indigenous practitioners and Indigenous health consumers. The working group will be chaired by Linda Renouf, a senior and very respected Aboriginal AHPRA board member and a lawyer with years of experience sitting on notifications committees, and supported by Mr Kevin Yao Yi, a Waka Waka South Sea Islander man who's been newly appointed to the HSU and a trained social worker also here. A second project I wanted to highlight is the research that is taking place to evaluate the impact of embedding cultural safety longitudinally within the scheme and the broader healthcare system and for the benefit of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander health consumers. One of the research projects to commence with the appropriate Indigenous expertise is around coronial inquests into the deaths of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander persons involving registered health practitioners who are the subject of notifications relating to their death. As you can see, the work is far-reaching, from law to process to creating an evidence base to research. Please, if any of you are interested in joining a board or committee, reach out to Brother Pat Murphy, also sitting at this front table, who is here for the next few days to discuss. We really need you. It's also in this critical work that we can contribute to the scaffolding to support safe environments for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander professions who provide care, and for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples deserving of care. Increasing the number of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander practitioners, of course, is very important. But colonial institutions are extremely violent, so we must do more and do better to ensure their safety. As a researcher, I've learned a lot about health regulation, working outside my profession, but being able to contribute because of the different research skills that I have. So switching gears, I want to share some of the exciting research that I have the honour of being involved in, led by Marnanjali and South Sea Islander Professor Chelsea Wadago, on the development of an Indigenous health humanities as a new and innovative field of research that builds intellectual collective capable of bridging the knowledge gap that currently hinders our efforts to close the gap in Indigenous health. By bringing together health and humanities through Indigenous scholarship, a deeper understanding of the human experience of health will be developed, alongside a greater understanding of the enablers to building a transdisciplinary collective of Indigenous researchers. The formation of this field is grounded in our shared rage of the violence of this place and a commitment to a more sustainable, relational and ethical approach to advancing new knowledge and health outcomes for Indigenous people. The creation of this new discipline provides an intellectual home for the exiled, a home which is open to the expansion to accommodate the increasing members who find warmth and solidarity in the refusal of injustice that binds us both intellectually and politically to such a place. As one of the stream leads, I'll focus on defining Indigenous epidemiology, an epidemiology that will stretch the parameters of our existing attempts at strengths-based approaches within the discipline to foreground Indigenous sovereignty and survival, including more meaningful accounting for race that does not continue to render Indigenous peoples statistically insignificant or inferior. Through disloyalty to the discipline I have trained in, and again by zooming out on the specific area of research I focus on, the parameters of my thinking have been extended well beyond that of epidemiology. To work alongside and in partnership with race scholars, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander health professionals, lawyers, journalists, philosophers. It's allowed me to understand more fully the piece of the puzzle that I hold and how it fits together in the broadest sense of Indigenous health. Looking beyond our own disciplines, but being grounded in our accountability to blackfellas, forces us to consider how institutions, structures, systems and processes operate to undermine Indigenous health and wellbeing. But it also equips us, or at least helps build skills required for imagining and enabling Indigenous health and wellness on our terms. So coming back to the puzzle piece, when looking at the big picture, working with other professionals allows you to be critical about the parameters of your own profession. What piece of the puzzle do you hold? How is it in relation to others? What is the work that truly needs to be done? And who are you most accountable to? Black excellence in colonial institution requires different strategies, all that are committed to improving Indigenous health. But it does come at a cost. It requires for all of us to think beyond our discipline, a bringing together of different methodologies, different worldviews, a different way of knowing and being in a relational rather than a hierarchical manner, and recognising the limitations of different knowledge systems, including our own, being strategic with the fights that we take on, knowing when just to stand in resistance, but never compromising on who we are and who we belong to. Thank you.